Hey guys, tonight we begin on a dusty road that stretches from the vineyards of France all the way to the sunburned hills of Palestine. You're barefoot, your pack is empty, and you're walking beside a man who believes the world is ending and that the only way to save your soul is to die trying. All around you, the scent of sweat, incense, and old bread thickens in the heat. Children cry. Priests chant. Somewhere ahead, beyond deserts and death, is Jerusalem. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if slow and gentle storytelling is truly your thing. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts with a barefoot monk, a man with wild eyes, a voice that could split the air, and a message that spread like fire across medieval Europe. His name was Peter, though history would remember him as Peter the Hermit. He didn't look like much, unwashed, unshaven, probably reeking of onions and divine purpose. But when he climbed up on a barrel in a village square, people listened, and what they heard was terrifying. He told them that the Holy Land, the place where Christ had walked, bled, and died, had been taken by the enemies of God. He said Christian pilgrims were being attacked, that the tomb of Christ was desecrated, and that the apocalypse was coming. And most dangerously of all, he promised that if you dropped everything, your plow, your debts, your doubts, and took the cross, you could save your soul. No one fact-checked him. No one asked about logistics. They just listened and wept and believed. Because the year was 1095, and the world already felt like it was ending. Crops were failing. Plagues kept coming back. Armies trampled the countryside, and nobles fought pointless wars over muddy fields. The average person had never left their village, never owned more than one set of clothes, and never had a reason to hope, until Peter showed up, barefoot and blazing, offering them something they'd never had: purpose. So they walked, tens of thousands of them. Some were old. Some were children. Some were thieves looking for a fresh start. Others were devout believers with nothing but a rosary and a dream. They came from France, Germany, Italy, different languages, same desperation. They stitched red crosses onto their tunics and called themselves pilgrims, even though they were armed and ready to kill. This wasn't a crusade led by kings and knights. Not yet. This was the People's Crusade, a chaotic stampede of souls chasing salvation across a map they didn't understand. They had no supplies, no strategy, no plan beyond walk east until we find Jerusalem. They flooded into Eastern Europe, overwhelming towns, looting Jewish communities, and collapsing local economies. And then when they reached the edges of Christendom, they kept going. They were completely unprepared for what came next. Because to reach Jerusalem, they had to cross the deserts of Anatolia, where the sun killed faster than swords, and the only water came with arrows. But we're not there yet. To understand how tens of thousands of poor, desperate, and devout Europeans ended up dying in a foreign wasteland, we need to rewind just a little to a single speech that started it all. Because Peter the Hermit may have lit the match, but the Pope handed him the torch. It's November 1095, and the air in Clermont, France, is heavy with incense, sweat, and the whispers of 1,000 men waiting to hear a sermon that might change the world. At the center of the crowd stands Pope Urban II. He doesn't look like a firebrand, but what comes out of his mouth will ripple across continents, reshape empires, and leave tens of thousands dead. He doesn't just talk about religion, he talks about liberation. He tells the crowd that their Christian brothers and sisters in the East are under siege, that the infidel Turks have taken Jerusalem, defiled the holy sites, and are choking the cradle of Christianity. He says Christ himself commands them to act. He says if they take up the sword and go east to fight for the Holy Land, they'll be absolved of all their sins, every lie, every theft, every secret shame erased. It's the ultimate spiritual loophole, eternal salvation, in exchange for picking up a weapon. The crowd erupts. They cry out, Deus vult! God wills it. They drop to their knees in tears. Some cut red crosses into their clothing on the spot. Others fall into a kind of religious ecstasy. But Urban isn't just preaching piety. He's making a political move. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of Christendom, had asked for military aid against the encroaching Seljuk Turks. They wanted mercenaries, elite troops, maybe a handful of skilled knights. What Urban gives them instead is a holy war, because he sees opportunity. The papacy has been in a long-standing tug-of-war with secular rulers across Europe. This crusade, a term that hadn't even been invented yet, could bind the nobility, the peasants, and the church into a single, unstoppable machine. It's faith weaponized, and just beneath the surface of righteousness is a deep vein of greed. Urban frames the journey as both sacrifice and reward. Jerusalem is painted as a land of milk and honey, riches, relics, glory. He stirs up every emotion he can fear: hope, revenge, salvation. And it works. Knights who've spent their lives raiding each other's castles suddenly find common cause. Peasants who've never owned more than a hoe and a hovel believe they're destined to become soldiers of Christ. And so, thousands answer the call. But here's where things go sideways fast. Because the first to leave aren't knights, they're peasants. They don't wait for orders. They don't understand supply lines or tactics. They don't even bring enough food. They just go. And this wave, this early tsunami of true believers, becomes the People's Crusade, a mass movement so chaotic, so tragic, and so poorly planned that it barely makes it out of Europe. Peter the Hermit, the wild-eyed preacher from earlier, becomes their spiritual mascot. He claims he's been chosen by God to lead the way. He rides a donkey, wears rags, eats scraps, and thousands follow him like he's Moses. But Peter isn't Moses. He's a matchstick in a hurricane. The People's Crusade sweeps across the countryside, disorganized and destructive. In the Rhineland, some of them turn on Jewish communities, not as part of the Crusade's goal, but out of raw hatred and ignorance. They massacre hundreds, maybe thousands. It's the first bloodshed of the First Crusade, and it happens before anyone even reaches the front lines. And still, more keep joining. Whole families, teenagers, former criminals, ex-soldiers, dreamers, fanatics. They march to Constantinople, clogging roads, draining local resources, and annoying the Byzantine emperor so thoroughly that he just wants them gone. But getting them across the Bosphorus into Turkish-held Anatolia, that's not salvation. That's a death sentence. And we're about to see why. Because once the People's Crusade crosses that invisible line from Christian lands into enemy territory, they discover what this war really means. You've made it to Constantinople somehow. Your feet are cracked, your belly is empty, and your fellow soldiers smell like onions and unconfessed sins. But you've arrived. The shining capital of the Eastern Roman Empire glitters across the Bosphorus, and for a moment, it feels like the pilgrimage might actually work. Except nobody here wants you. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I, stares at the crowd of thousands outside his city walls with a mix of horror and disbelief. He had asked for professional soldiers, trained knights, armored lords, disciplined warriors. Instead, he got Peter the Hermit's fan club, tens of thousands of peasants, beggars, self-proclaimed prophets, and maybe 3 people who know how to use a sword properly. They're camped in makeshift tents outside the gates. They're hungry. They're loud. They're starting to steal food from local markets. To Alexios, this isn't an army. It's a plague. He wants them out of his empire as fast as possible, but not before making them swear allegiance to him. A symbolic gesture, sure, but one with real consequences later. Because these crusaders don't think of themselves as mercenaries. They think of themselves as holy warriors, God's chosen, above politics. Still, the emperor ferries them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia, hoping the Turks will deal with them. And they do. At first, everything seems calm. The crusaders wander through the Turkish countryside, looting villages, attacking anything that moves, convinced that every step brings them closer to Jerusalem. But the Turks are watching. The Seljuk Turks had recently fractured into rival factions, but one man still commands respect: Kilij Arslan, the Sultan of Rum. And when he hears that thousands of disorganized, poorly armed Europeans are traipsing through his territory like it's a Sunday picnic, he decides to act. It's not a battle, it's an execution. In October 1096, near the town of Civitat, Kilij Arslan launches a surprise attack. The People's Crusade never stands a chance. Most of them aren't even armed. Some don't know how to fight. Others flee at the first sight of cavalry. Entire camps are slaughtered. Thousands die in a single afternoon, run down, cut down, or captured and sold into slavery. Peter the Hermit? He wasn't even there. He had gone back to Constantinople to beg the emperor for more food. Of the original tens of thousands who marched out of Europe, only a few hundred make it back alive. And this, right here, is what most people forget about the First Crusade. It didn't begin with noble knights storming the gates of Jerusalem. It began with chaos, miscommunication, and one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the Middle Ages. But it was only the beginning, because while the People's Crusade died in the dust, the real crusaders, the armored lords, the banner-bearing knights, the ones who actually knew how to fight, were just getting started. And what they were about to do would change the world forever. They came not in rags, but in steel. As the last tattered survivors of the People's Crusade limped back toward Constantinople, the real crusading armies began to arrive organized, armored, and far more dangerous. These were the heavy hitters, not villagers with kitchen knives, but war-tested nobles from the great houses of Europe. Men like Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Godfrey of Bouillon, and his brother Baldwin. They brought with them thousands of knights, squires, cooks, priests, siege engineers, and baggage trains, so large they looked like moving cities. But don't mistake them for one united army. This wasn't one crusade. It was many crusades happening at once, each led by a powerful lord with his own goals, rivalries, and grievances. They had answered Pope Urban's call, yes, but they also had personal ambitions. Some came for God, some came for glory, many came for land. And none of them trusted each other. When they reached Constantinople in late 1096 and early 1097, Emperor Alexios found himself in a diplomatic nightmare, hosting thousands of elite foreign soldiers, men who could either save his empire or carve it up. So he made them all swear oaths. Each crusading leader was required to swear loyalty to Alexios and promise to return any recaptured territory to the Byzantine Empire. It was a clever move, legally binding and politically potent. But it left a bad taste. Men like Bohemond and Godfrey weren't planning to hand back anything. They didn't cross half of Europe to play errand boys for a distant emperor. Still, they swore the oaths grudgingly, because they needed him. Alexios had maps, money, supply lines. Most importantly, he could ferry them across the Bosphorus safely and offer guides through the foreign terrain ahead. And the Crusaders were smart enough to realize that marching blind into Turkish lands without local help was basically suicide. So they agreed, and the crusade finally crossed into enemy territory, not as a starving mob, but as an army. In May of 1097, they reached their first real target, Nicaea, a city of massive walls, fresh water, and awkwardly, one of the former capitals of the Byzantine Empire. The siege of Nicaea was the Crusaders' first real test, and it was messy. The Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan, the same one who had massacred the People's Crusade, wasn't there. He'd taken his army elsewhere, underestimating this new wave of better-equipped invaders. So the Crusaders surrounded the city, cut off supply lines, and built siege towers. Byzantine ships arrived to blockade the lake that Nicaea sat beside, completing the circle. And then came the betrayal. As the Crusaders prepared for a final assault, the Byzantines snuck into the city through negotiations and raised the imperial flag. The city had surrendered but to Alexios, not the Crusaders. The knights were furious. They'd bled for this city, lost men, wasted supplies, and now the loot, the honor, the credit, all taken by the emperor. It was a warning. If the Byzantines couldn't be trusted to share victory, then maybe the Crusaders didn't need to share at all. And that shift, subtle, bitter, and spreading, would eventually fracture the uneasy alliance between East and West. But for now, they pressed on, because Jerusalem still lay hundreds of miles away, and the land ahead, Anatolia, would make Nicaea look like a picnic, because crossing it meant entering a new kind of hell, a place of blistering heat, poisoned wells, endless dust, and enemies who vanished like ghosts. And this is where the crusade begins to burn. Imagine this. It's 100 degrees. The sun is a white hammer in the sky, and your chainmail is cooking your flesh like a slow-roasted pig. Welcome to Anatolia, where the landscape isn't just hostile, it's actively trying to kill you. After the fall of Nicaea, in June 1097, the Crusaders set out eastward across central Anatolia. They thought this would be the hard march, the part you suffer through before you get to the glory. What they didn't realize was that this stretch of road would become a graveyard. There were no cities to resupply in, no rivers that didn't reek of rot or shimmer with disease. The Turkish strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Don't fight the Crusaders' head. On, bleed them out. Villages were burned. Wells were poisoned. Fields were razed. The Crusaders had no maps, no understanding of the terrain, and no idea how to survive in the arid hellscape of the Anatolian plateau. Horses began collapsing by the dozens, not from wounds, but from exhaustion and dehydration. Some soldiers were so desperate they slit their animals' throats to drink the blood. They tried marching at night to avoid the sun. But that brought its own horrors. Men slipped in the dark. Scouts vanished. Shadows moved along the ridgelines, Turkish horse archers who struck from a distance and disappeared before anyone could react. These were not brawling warriors. They were ghosts with bows, and they were masters of psychological warfare. It didn't take long for morale to crumble. Even the elite knights, proud and defiant at Nicaea, began to falter. The great war horses were dying. The men walked hunched, blistered, their eyes sunken, their lips split from thirst. Some whispered that the Holy Land was cursed. Others began to wonder if this was God's punishment, not his plan. And then came Dorylaeum. On the 1st of July, 1097, Bohemond's contingent, one part of the fractured crusading host, set up camp near a riverbed, thinking it was a safe resting point. They were wrong. Kilij Arslan had returned, and this time he brought allies. At dawn, the Crusader camp was attacked by thousands of mounted Turkish warriors. Arrows rained from the hills. Horses panicked. Men scattered. Bohemond's troops, surrounded and outnumbered, formed tight defensive circles, shields out, spears ready, and braced for death. For 6 agonizing hours, they held their ground. And just when it seemed they'd be wiped out, like the People's Crusade before them, the second wave of Crusader forces arrived. Godfrey, Raymond, the full might of the Frankish knights. Together, they counterattacked. Heavy cavalry thundered into the Turkish flanks. For the first time, the Turks couldn't simply harass and retreat. They were dragged into a full melee. And while they were agile, the Crusaders were brutal. Swords met flesh. Arrows thudded into shields. Blood soaked the dust. By sunset, Kilij Arslan's forces were retreating. It was a miracle victory, the kind that would be sung about in churches and carved into stone. But it was also a warning. The road ahead was not paved with divine favor. It was paved with bones. And now, with half their horses gone, their supplies dwindling, and the summer only getting hotter, the Crusaders faced an even more terrifying reality. They hadn't even reached the halfway point. And the next place they were heading to, it would test not just their bodies, but their souls. Welcome to Antioch, the fortress city that would break men's minds. By October 1097, after months of brutal marching, sunstroke, and ambushes, the Crusaders reached the towering stone walls of Antioch. It was enormous, imposing, and absolutely essential. Whoever controlled Antioch controlled the gateway to the Levant, the road to Jerusalem, and every supply route in between. But there was one small problem. Antioch was built to not fall. Its walls climbed the surrounding hills like stone serpents, massive, thick, and patrolled constantly. It had food, water, and a garrison that knew how to wait out a siege. Inside were thousands of Turkish and Armenian troops. Outside were tens of thousands of starving, exhausted Crusaders. And still, they surrounded it. The siege of Antioch wasn't swift. It wasn't glorious. It was a 9-month-long horror show. A slow-motion spiral of hunger, paranoia, and spiritual delirium. At first, morale held. The Crusaders had already survived Anatolia. They had faith. They had momentum. But then came the rain. Cold, endless rain. And with it, the mud, the rot, and the dysentery. Horses died by the hundreds, then dogs, then rats, and finally, people. The Crusaders were reduced to eating grass, leather, even dirt. Some dug up enemy corpses and boiled them. Others chewed on wood just to pretend they were eating. Starvation didn't just gnaw at their bellies, it broke their minds. Knights abandoned their posts. Entire companies deserted. A few even tried to flee back to Constantinople. But there was nowhere to go. Behind them was the wasteland of Anatolia. In front of them, a fortress that mocked them from every parapet. And then came the snow. Winter fell like a curse. Fires struggled in the wind. Clothes froze stiff. Men huddled in filthy tents, muttering prayers, hallucinating about warm bread and soft beds. Disease spread like wildfire. Even noblemen were reduced to skeletons wrapped in moldy wool. If a man had a crust of bread, he slept on it, afraid someone would kill him in the night just for a bite. And yet, they stayed. Why? Because Antioch was a test. The church had framed this war as a holy trial. Every ounce of suffering was supposed to be spiritual weight, pain that purified the soul. Leaving now would mean abandoning God. And worse, it would mean no redemption. So they endured. And finally, in the spring of 1098, a miracle, or something like it. Bohemond, the cunning southern Italian warlord, made contact with a traitor inside the city. A guard, a convert, someone who, for a price, would open a postern gate under cover of darkness. And it worked. On the night of the 2nd of June, Bohemond's men slipped inside, scaled the walls, and threw open the gates. The Crusaders stormed in, overwhelmed the defenders, and after months of starvation, unleashed pure fury. The sack of Antioch was savage. Civilians were slaughtered in the streets, houses burned, mosques desecrated. Anything that could be stolen was ripped from the walls and packed into sacks. Blood flowed through the alleys. But the timing couldn't have been worse, because as they celebrated, a new army arrived, one that made Kilij Arslan's forces look like a bar fight. The mighty General Kerboga of Mosul was marching toward them with a coalition of tens of thousands. And suddenly, the Crusaders, starving, scattered, and now inside the very city they had just besieged, became the besieged. Antioch had become a trap, and their only way out? A vision, a lie, a spear, and a miracle no one saw coming. So you've survived the siege, broken into Antioch, and watched half your companions go mad with hunger or burn the city in a frenzy. You're thinking maybe now finally the worst is over. It isn't. Because just days after you take the city, a dust cloud rises on the horizon. It's not weather. It's Kerboga, a seasoned general from Mosul, leading a coalition of Turkish, Arab, and Persian forces so massive it darkens the plains outside Antioch. Estimates vary: 30,000? 40,000? Maybe more. Doesn't matter. You're trapped inside the city you just conquered, and now the walls that kept them out are keeping you in. There's no food, no reinforcements, no help coming from Constantinople. Alexios, the Byzantine emperor, had turned around weeks earlier, spooked by reports of Crusader infighting and fearful he'd be next on their hit list. So here you are, starving, surrounded, abandoned, and slowly realizing that maybe this wasn't the divine mission you thought it was. Morale collapses. Deserters slip out at night and are caught and flayed alive. Others walk into enemy lines hoping for mercy. There's even talk of surrender. But then from a fevered corner of the city, a miracle is found. Or so they say. A low-ranking priest named Peter Bartholomew announces that Saint Andrew has appeared to him in a dream and revealed the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion. At first, people scoff. A man in a city full of them. But Bohemond, ever the opportunist, sees potential. Because what the army needs isn't just food, it needs hope. So, with a crowd of starving men watching, Peter digs under the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter. Hours pass. Nothing. Then, conveniently, he pulls out a rusted spearhead. Is it real? Probably not. But the Crusaders don't care. They erupt. It's divine confirmation, they say. God is with them. This is proof. A sign. Spirits rise like smoke. Knights kiss the spear. Men weep. Whether it was genuine belief or collective delusion, the effect is the same. Now they're ready to fight. Bohemond rallies them into formation barefoot, starving, wrapped in rags and scraps of mail, but on fire with belief. They pray all night. They fast, even hungrier than before. And then, on the 28th of June, 1098, they open the gates and charge. What happens next is one of the most bizarre and unlikely victories in medieval history. Kerboga's massive army is caught off guard, not expecting such a bold move. His coalition, made up of rival emirs and generals, is already fracturing. Some don't trust him. Others are just waiting to see who wins before they commit. So when the Crusaders surge out screaming, "Deus Vult," something strange happens. The Turks falter. The Crusaders push harder. Bohemond's cavalry slams into one flank. Godfrey and Raymond lead the center. Even barefoot monks are in the mix, waving crosses and singing psalms. The Crusaders fight like demons, not for land, not for loot, but because they're sure God himself is watching. By nightfall, Kerboga is gone. His army scatters. And the Crusaders, against all logic, all odds, and every rule of warfare, have won. They fall to their knees, weeping. They survived. Again. But if you think this means the end of suffering, you haven't been paying attention. Because while they now control Antioch, they're still hundreds of miles from Jerusalem. And something's brewing among their leaders, a rift, a hunger, a plan. Because for some of them, the Holy Land can wait. But a throne? That's now. Bohemond stands on the ramparts of Antioch, the wind tugging at his ragged cloak, staring not toward Jerusalem but inward at the city he just helped conquer. And he makes a decision. He's not going any farther. See, Bohemond didn't come to the Holy Land for spiritual redemption. He came for land, power, a slice of empire. And now, with Antioch starved and broken but his, he refuses to hand it over to the Byzantines, despite the oath he swore to Emperor Alexios months earlier. He declares himself Prince of Antioch. It's treason, technically, but nobody stops him. The Byzantine reinforcements never arrived. The other crusade leaders are too weak to fight another war. And honestly, they're kind of impressed. Boldness like that has its own gravity in the medieval world. But it also splinters the crusade. What was once a single, if fragile, mission to take Jerusalem now becomes something murkier, part pilgrimage, part land grab. Bohemond sets up his own court, builds alliances, fortifies the city. Antioch becomes the first of many crusader states that will eventually spring up like weeds in blood-soaked soil. And still Jerusalem calls. By early 1099, after nearly 3 years of starvation, sieges, and betrayal, the Crusader host begins to move again. But it's not the same army that left Europe. They've been reduced to a skeleton crew, maybe 12,000 men, ragged, diseased, and full of ghosts. Some wear parts of stolen Turkish armor. Others walk barefoot. The horses are thin. The priests are hoarse, but the fire hasn't gone out. If anything, it burns hotter. Because Jerusalem isn't just a city anymore. It's a promise. It's the finish line, the reward, the place where every agony will finally make sense. But getting there means passing through 1,000 miles of enemy territory. The Crusaders march south, through Syria, and into Palestine. Along the way, they clash with local Muslim forces, negotiate with Christian and Jewish towns, and occasionally beg supplies from anyone too scared to say no. It's not holy, it's survival. In early June 1099, the Crusaders finally crest a dusty hill, and there it is. Jerusalem, the city of God, the beating heart of 3 religions, a walled stronghold glittering in the haze. They fall to their knees, weeping. But there's no time for worship. The walls are high, the garrison is fresh, and the Crusaders are dying of thirst. The siege begins. But unlike Antioch, there's no lengthy buildup. The Crusaders know they don't have months. Supplies are running out. The desert is swallowing them whole. So they build siege towers from stolen wood, drag them across the sand, and brace for a final, terrible assault. And then, in the darkness before dawn on the 15th of July, 1099 they attack. It's a frenzy. Ladders crash against stone. Arrows whistle through the air. Boiling oil rains down. Men scream prayers, curses, and orders. And somehow, some way, they breach the walls. The gates fall. The Crusaders flood into Jerusalem, and what follows is not a triumph. It's a massacre. We'll get to that next. Because to understand what the crusade became in that moment, you have to see what they did once they got what they wanted. The gates of Jerusalem grown open, and the Crusaders, starving, sunburned, blistered, and half-mad, pour in like a wave of steel and fury. They're not singing hymns. They're not walking in reverent silence. They are shouting, laughing, crying, cutting. Because for them, this isn't a city, it's a prize. What happens next is one of the bloodiest events in medieval history, not a battle, but a slaughter. The Crusaders rampage through the streets, killing everything that moves. Muslim fighters, civilians, women, children, even animals. No one is spared. Not in homes, not in mosques, not even in holy places. They storm into the Al-Aqsa Mosque and turn it into a charnel house. Eyewitnesses, even Christian ones, report that the blood in the streets reached up to the Crusaders' ankles. Others say it splashed against their knees. Modern historians debate the numbers, but everyone agrees it was brutal. The massacre lasts for 2 days. By the end, tens of thousands are dead. Entire neighborhoods are reduced to ashes. And inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site believed to house Christ's tomb, the Crusaders finally fall to their knees, covered in blood, weeping, thanking God. To them, this is divine justice, the sword made sacred. But to anyone watching, anyone not caught up in the fever dream of holy war, it looks more like apocalypse than salvation. And here's the cruel irony. For all their effort, The Crusaders didn't really capture Jerusalem from the Seljuks. By the time they arrived, the city had been taken by the Fatimids, a rival Muslim faction. The Crusaders weren't liberating the city from their enemy. They were just picking up the pieces of someone else's civil war. But at this point, no one cares. On the 22nd of July, 1099, barely a week after the blood-dried Godfrey of Bouillon is elected defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He refuses the title of king, saying he won't wear a crown of gold where Christ wore a crown of thorns. But make no mistake, this is now a Christian kingdom. Latin rule, Western laws, Crusader lords. Jerusalem is no longer a holy city, it's a fortress. And while some of the Crusaders finally start the long journey home, many stay. They marry local women. They carve out estates. They start calling themselves by new titles of Jerusalem, of Tripoli, of Edessa. The First Crusade is technically over, but the fire it lit, it won't go out. Because back in Europe, tales of the miracle at Jerusalem, the lance, the visions, the victory will spread like wildfire. More Crusaders will come, more blood will spill, and the Muslim world, they've just begun to notice. A storm is coming, and the real war is only just beginning. Back in Europe, word spreads like wildfire. The holy city has been taken. Jerusalem is Christian again. The Crusaders, ragged, half-dead, starving, have succeeded where empires failed. And that success doesn't just inspire awe, it inspires envy. Because now every minor noble, every restless knight, every ambitious second son hears the same whisper, if they could do it, so could you. The First Crusade becomes legend almost instantly. Preachers spin the story not as a brutal death march, but as divine triumph. The sieges? Heroic. The massacres? Justified. The suffering? Holy. And most important of all, the door to heaven was open. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about redemption, a chance to cleanse your soul in blood and sand, and maybe get a plot of land in the process. The Pope, now Urban II's successors, fans the flames even further. Sermons thunder from pulpits. Crosses are stitched onto cloaks. A new wave of crusaders begins to gather. But something else is happening, too, something more subtle. In the Muslim world, the crusade had initially seemed like a fluke, just another barbarian incursion, a Western tantrum that would burn out. After all, the Islamic world was fractured Fatimids in Egypt, Seljuks in Anatolia, petty emirs everywhere else. They weren't exactly united. But now, with Jerusalem lost and entire cities slaughtered, the Crusaders had gotten everyone's attention. And the Muslim world starts to wake up. Writers begin to document the horror. Scholars frame the Crusaders as both religious enemies and uncivilized beasts. And slowly, a new idea takes root. Jihad not just as a personal struggle, but as a collective call to arms. It will take time for this fire to spread. But once it does, it will bring forth names that will echo for centuries. Zengi, Nur ad-Din, Saladin. But we're not there yet. Back in Jerusalem, the Crusaders are already stretched thin. They've taken the city, yes, but holding it? That's another story. The surrounding countryside is still hostile. The Fatimids are preparing a counterattack. And the kingdom they just founded is little more than a handful of knights clinging to a city full of ghosts. Then, in August 1099, the test comes. The Fatimid army marches north from Egypt. determined to reclaim Jerusalem. They hit the Crusaders near the coastal city of Ascalon. This time, the Crusaders don't wait to be besieged. They charge. And once again, against every expectation, they win. The Fatimids are routed. Ascalon holds, but the road to Jerusalem remains in Crusader hands. It feels like the end of something, but it's really the beginning. Because the First Crusade didn't solve the problem, it created one. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem and the other Crusader states will become permanent scars in the Middle East. Every alliance, every truce, every battle for the next 2 centuries will revolve around them. And every child raised in those lands will grow up in the shadow of that first march of madness when tens of thousands walked across the known world, starved, slaughtered, and then proclaimed themselves holy. And those who survived? They would never forget what it felt like to win. But they'd also never stop looking over their shoulders. Because now, the world knew they were there. And the response was coming. So what did it all mean? Tens of thousands left Europe thinking they were going on a pilgrimage, a holy journey to cleanse the soul. But what they walked into was something else entirely. A brutal collision between faith, empire, and reality. The First Crusade wasn't organized. It wasn't rational. It wasn't even planned very well. It was messy, violent, and held together more by desperation and myth than by strategy. But somehow it worked. The Crusaders carved out a foothold in the Holy Land. They captured Jerusalem. They founded a Christian kingdom in the heart of the Islamic world. And yet, it cost them everything. Of the estimated 60,000 who began the journey, only a fraction lived to see Jerusalem. Most died of disease, hunger, or ambushes. Many more simply turned back, broken. The ones who remained were forever changed, hardened, haunted. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The First Crusade wasn't just a war of religion. It was a war of opportunity. Many who marched did so not out of piety, but poverty. Younger sons without land. Knights with too much armor and not enough purpose. Merchants chasing markets. Preachers chasing power. Pope Urban II may have sparked the flame, but the wildfire that followed was fed by more than faith. It was fed by ambition and suffering, and the deep, aching human need to believe that our pain means something. But the world they left behind in Europe, that changed too. The Crusades brought new ideas, new goods, and new fears. Contact with the Islamic world introduced Europeans to advanced medicine, philosophy, mathematics, and art. But it also introduced suspicion of the East, of Muslims, of anything foreign. It birthed a new vocabulary of violence, wrapped in the language of virtue. Words like infidel, concepts like just war. The seeds of colonialism, of holy violence, were planted in these sun-bleached deserts. And once planted, they would be very hard to unroot. But let's zoom back in to the men and women who walked. They didn't know they were making history. They weren't thinking about long-term cultural exchange. They were starving, sunburned, covered in lice. Most of them had never left their village before. Now they were in Jerusalem, ankle-deep in blood, whispering prayers and wondering if God had really wanted this. Some went home legends. Others stayed, building castles, raising families, waiting for the inevitable retaliation. And that retaliation would come. The Second Crusade, the fall of Edessa, the rise of Saladin, the sack of Constantinople. The Crusades weren't one war. They were a chain reaction. a worldview built on conquest and divine destiny echoing across centuries. But this first march, this trek across deserts and mountains, this story of rot and glory was where it all began. It was never supposed to work, and yet it did. At a cost no one could ever calculate. Back home in Europe, something strange begins to happen. The men who return from the First Crusade, the few who survived, aren't just greeted as heroes. They're treated like pilgrims who walked through hell and lived to tell about it. Their scars become sacred. Their stories, exaggerated and embellished, become scripture adjacent in the eyes of the villagers who stayed behind. And soon, the First Crusade transforms from a half-improvised bloodbath into a divinely orchestrated epic, a myth in the making. Troubadours sing about it. Monks write about it. Even those who had nothing to do with it start claiming they were there, marching beside Godfrey or storming the walls of Jerusalem with a cross in one hand and a sword in the other. But here's the thing. Those returning warriors didn't come home unchanged. Many were hollow-eyed, haunted. Some couldn't speak about what they'd seen. Others couldn't stop. They had marched across a continent, buried friends in foreign dirt, killed in the name of salvation, and now they were supposed to just go back to farming? To sitting in church, beside people who had never seen what they had seen? Some tried to reintegrate. Others drank, or wandered, or sold their stories for favors and land. But all of them carried something invisible, a kind of spiritual sunburn, a belief that they had been chosen, set apart, tested, and that everything in life before had been a dream. The real world, the holy world, had revealed itself out there in the desert. Back in the monasteries and courts, scholars begin to analyze what happened. Did it really begin at Clermont, with Pope Urban's fiery sermon? Or did it begin earlier with the fragmentation of the Islamic world, the rise of pilgrim traffic to Jerusalem, the growing pressure inside Europe as sons without land looked east? No one can agree, but they all agree on one thing. It changed everything. And beneath the hymns and prayers, there's a quieter undercurrent, a knowledge that this holy war, successful as it seemed, had let loose a kind of violence wrapped in sanctity that could never be fully controlled again. The church has tasted blood, and the people have tasted absolution through killing. It's a recipe that would be used again, and again, and again. Meanwhile, in the Holy Land, the Crusader states begin to take shape. Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, 4 fragile kingdoms surrounded by enemies and constantly short on men, supplies, and loyalty. Their rulers spend more time putting out internal fires than preparing for external threats. Feudal squabbles break out. Lords backstab each other. Castles change hands. And every passing year brings more pilgrims, some devout, others just opportunistic, looking to stake a claim in this new world of blood and blessings. But there's a ticking clock, because in cities like Damascus and Aleppo, Muslim scholars and warlords are starting to realize what's been lost and what must be reclaimed. A new generation is rising, one that doesn't see the Crusaders as misguided pilgrims. They see them as invaders, and soon a name will rise among them that will rewrite everything. But to understand how the tide turns, we have to step into that world, the Islamic world, and see what the First Crusade looked like from their side. That's coming. And when it does, the story takes a darker, sharper turn. To the Islamic world, the arrival of the Crusaders was not immediately seen as a world-shifting event. At first, they were just another group of foreign fighters. Dangerous, yes, but not existential. After all, the Islamic world in the late 11th century was fractured. The Fatimids ruled Egypt. The Seljuks held much of Syria and Anatolia. Local emirs governed their own cities, like many caliphates. Unity was a memory. But once Jerusalem fell, everything changed. The slaughter of Muslim civilians included wasn't just a defeat, it was a shock to the soul of the Islamic world. The massacre at Al-Aqsa Mosque reverberated far beyond the walls of Jerusalem. Stories spread of infidels drinking blood, of mosques turned to tombs, of holy ground desecrated, and it began to dawn on rulers and scholars alike. This wasn't just another Byzantine incursion. This was something else. This was a crusade. But at first, no united response came. The emirs were too busy fighting each other. Many still saw the Crusaders as pawns, tools to be used against rival Muslim factions. In fact, some Muslim rulers allied with the Crusaders. Others sold them supplies. Still others thought they'd go away on their own. But there were exceptions, voices warning that this was bigger than a border skirmish. One of the earliest was al-Azimi, a chronicler from Aleppo. He described the Crusaders as brutal, faithless, and unlike any enemy the Islamic world had known. They weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting for cosmic supremacy. And slowly, this idea took hold. Poets began to mourn Jerusalem in verse. Scholars framed its loss as a punishment from God, a test to awaken the faithful. And in mosques across the region, sermons began to ring with a new urgency. Then came Imad ad-Din Zengi, a Turkish Atabeg from Mosul. Zengi was not a holy man. He was a warlord, but he had vision. He understood that to defeat the Crusaders, the Islamic world couldn't stay divided. He called for unity not just of sword, but of purpose. He didn't call it a crusade, but it was something close, a jihad. In 1144, he launched an assault on Edessa, the first Crusader state established during the First Crusade. The city fell, and the shock echoed all the way to Europe. Because Edessa wasn't just a military loss, it was a symbolic one. The idea that the Crusaders were chosen by God invincible, holy, ordained, shattered. And in Europe, panic set in. A new crusade was called. But that's another story. For now, Zengi's victory changed the game. He died shortly after assassinated in his sleep, but the spark he lit would burn brighter in his son, Nur ad-Din, and eventually blaze in the hands of a man who would become legend, Saladin. But even as the Islamic world began to stir, the Crusader states remained arrogant. They built castles, they argued over titles, they taxed the locals, they imported European laws into Middle Eastern soil. What they didn't do was prepare, because while they argued over relics and borders, the memory of Jerusalem's fall was becoming a mission. And revenge? Revenge had a name. Saladin didn't come out of nowhere. He was born in 1137 in Tikrit, in what is now Iraq, to a Kurdish family of modest but respected standing. His real name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but history would come to know him by a title that carried weight: Salah ad-Din, the righteousness of the faith. And unlike the brutal, boastful image many crusaders had painted of their Muslim enemies, Saladin would become something else, something far more dangerous. A man of faith, strategy, and vision, and most terrifyingly, patience. He wasn't born into empire, he rose into it. first under the mentorship of his uncle Shirkuh, a ruthless general in the service of Nur ad-Din, the son of Zengi. Together, they waged war in Egypt, which at the time was ruled by the Shiite Fatimids, religious rivals to the Sunni Seljuks of Syria. Through political intrigue and military genius, Saladin managed to do something extraordinary. He took Egypt without becoming a tyrant. When his uncle died, Saladin became vizier of Egypt then, slowly, the de facto ruler. But he didn't stop there. With Nur ad-Din's death in 1174, Saladin seized control of Syria, too claiming Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul through diplomacy, marriage, and if necessary, the sword. And suddenly, the Islamic world had something it hadn't had in generations: unity. Under Saladin, the dream of jihad not as rage, but as disciplined purpose came into focus. He emphasized justice, generosity, humility, and yes, vengeance. But not the wild vengeance of blood feuds. This was surgical. He reopened mosques, forgave enemies, reduced taxes, protected Christian minorities, even as he prepared to crush the Christian kingdoms of the Levant. The Crusaders, now 3 generations deep into their occupation, weren't ready. They had grown used to squabbling amongst themselves. Jerusalem was ruled by a leper king, Baldwin IV, and fractured noble houses vied for control through backroom deals and marriage alliances. Military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers acted like their own kingdoms. And as all of this brewed, Saladin was waiting, watching. Then came Reynold of Chatillon, a reckless, brutal crusader lord. Reynold had a habit of raiding Muslim caravans even during times of truce. In 1187, he attacked a caravan headed to Mecca. He killed women, took prisoners, laughed in the face of Saladin's ambassadors. That was it. Saladin rallied his forces. He called every emir, every veteran, every believer with a sword. This wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a reckoning. The stage was set for the Battle of Hattin, one of the most decisive confrontations in medieval history. The Crusaders, lured away from water sources under a blazing sun, were encircled and cut down near the Horns of Hattin. The result? Disaster. The Crusader army was obliterated. King Guy of Jerusalem was captured. Reynold beheaded personally by Saladin. The true cross, Christendom's most sacred relic, was taken as a trophy. And suddenly, the road to Jerusalem was open again. The Crusaders had taken the city in 1099 through fire and blood. Now, nearly a century later, Saladin was coming to take it back. The 2nd of October, 1187. The banners of Islam fly above Jerusalem once again. But this time, there is no slaughter, no rivers of blood, no mass crucifixions, no vengeance unleashed on civilians. When Saladin enters the holy city, it's not with fire, but with restraint. He had every reason to retaliate. The memory of 1099 burned in every Muslim heart. But Saladin, in that moment, chose something else: mercy as a weapon. Christian civilians were allowed to leave the city in peace, even ransomed. Others freed outright. Churches were spared. Priests kept their garments. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained untouched. It was a masterstroke. Because while swords win battles, narratives win wars. And Saladin was crafting a new one in which Islam was not only the victor, but the moral high ground. one where the East was no longer the chaotic playground of Western warlords, but a land of justice, law, and power. Europe, of course, didn't take the loss quietly. News of Jerusalem's fall ignited the Third Crusade, the most famous of them all. Richard the Lionheart, Frederick Barbarossa, Philip Augustus. Kings, this time, not ragged peasants or petty nobles. The Age of Kings had entered the Crusades, and Saladin would become their foil not just militarily, but symbolically. Because despite the violence, the two sides began to recognize something rare in each other: respect. Richard the Lionheart and Saladin never met in person, but they traded letters, gifts, even doctors. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent him fruit and snow to cool his fever. Their war was brutal, but chivalrous. In a world soaked with betrayal and fanaticism, this rivalry stood out as a strange, shining contradiction. But no peace could hold forever. Richard tried to retake Jerusalem, but failed. The war dragged on. Finally, in 1192, the two sides signed a treaty. Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims could visit freely. It wasn't a full victory, but it wasn't a total loss either. Saladin returned to Damascus. He would die the next year exhausted, aged, and with almost no money left. He had given it all away to the poor. And yet, his legend was only beginning. Even in Europe, Saladin was portrayed in medieval romances as a noble enemy, a just ruler, even a secret Christian in disguise. A strange honor for someone who had dealt Christendom its greatest wound. But perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was respect. Or perhaps, even then, people knew the truth. The First Crusade may have started the fire, but it was Saladin who showed what it meant to end it with dignity. And yet, the fire wasn't really out. It was still smoldering, waiting for the next spark. Because crusading wasn't just a one-time event anymore. It had become a habit, a system, a brand. And what came next would take that holy war to home. By the turn of the 13th century, the Crusades had morphed into something far stranger and darker. They were no longer just wars to reclaim the Holy Land. They had become a permanent part of European identity, a machine of violence, wrapped in prayer, ready to be pointed at any enemy the Church deemed unworthy of grace. And then came the most twisted crusade of all. The Fourth Crusade. It didn't go east to Jerusalem. It didn't even fight Muslims. Instead, in one of history's most surreal betrayals, the Crusaders turned their swords on a city that had been Christian for nearly 1,000 years. Constantinople. Yes, that Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire, the Second Rome, the jewel of Eastern Christianity. Why? Because of debt, politics, greed, and a dangerous mix of propaganda and convenient theology. Here's how it unraveled. The Pope, Innocent III, had called for a new crusade to retake Jerusalem after Saladin's death. A deal was made with Venice: build ships for the crusading army in exchange for money. But when the Crusaders couldn't pay their bill, Venice offered an alternative. Attack Zara Christian city in modern-day Croatia that had rebelled against Venetian control. The Crusaders agreed. They attacked. They pillaged. They were excommunicated by the Pope, briefly, then forgiven. But Zara was just the beginning. Soon, they were drawn into a Byzantine power struggle. A deposed prince promised gold, ships, and allegiance to Rome, in exchange for military help reclaiming his throne. The Crusaders saw an opportunity. So in 1203, they sailed to Constantinople to protect pilgrims, but to enforce a political bargain. What followed was chaos, riots, fire, broken deals. The prince they installed couldn't pay, the people rebelled, and the Crusaders, frustrated and hungry for loot, turned on the city. In 1204, Constantinople was sacked. Not just conquered, devastated. Churches were stripped of gold, monasteries were desecrated, priceless relics were stolen, nuns were assaulted, statues were melted down. Even the Hagia Sophia, the most sacred cathedral in Eastern Christendom, was looted and defiled. It wasn't a battle. It was a holy mafia job. And the defenders? They were fellow Christians. Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christians, spiritually distinct from the Latin West, but still under the umbrella of the Christian world. But in the Crusaders' eyes, that didn't matter anymore. The idea of crusade had become unmoored from its original goal. It was no longer about Jerusalem. It was about power, wealth, dominance. And if that meant burning one of the greatest Christian cities in history, so be it. The sack of Constantinople shattered the Byzantine Empire. It never truly recovered. And the memory of that betrayal would echo for centuries, contributing to the East-West schism between Orthodox and Catholic churches and deepening mistrust between Christians that, ironically, never healed. The Holy Land wasn't even touched during the Fourth Crusade, but a message had been sent. No one was safe, not even fellow Christians. And with this twisted evolution of holy war, the Crusades entered their next phase zone, where Jerusalem was just a memory, and the enemy could be anyone, even your neighbor. As the 13th century unfolded, the Crusade fever didn't die down, it metastasized. Now, you didn't need to cross the sea to fight for God. You could stay home and still wear the cross by turning it on your own people. Enter the Albigensian Crusade, southern France, early 1200s. A region known for troubadours, castles, and a vibrant culture of independent thought. But to the church, it had a problem. Heresy, specifically the Cathars. The Cathars believed in a dualistic faith, light versus dark, spirit versus flesh. They rejected the authority of the Pope, denounced the wealth of the church, believed the material world was evil. In short, they were a direct challenge to Catholic orthodoxy. And the church responded the only way it knew how, with holy war. In 1209, Pope Innocent III declared a crucidanate against Muslims, but against Christians. The Albigensian Crusade was brutal in ways the Holy Land had never seen. Because here, there was no foreign culture to misunderstand, no language barriers, no deserts, just neighbors turning on neighbors. The Crusaders descended on the Languedoc region with swords blessed and banners raised. One of the most infamous moments came during the siege of Béziers. A general asked the papal legate how to distinguish between the Cathars and the faithful within the city. The answer? Kill them all. God will know his own. And they did. The entire population of Béziersmen, women, children, Cathar, and Catholic alike was massacred. Estimates range from 7,000 to 20,000 killed in a single day. The streets ran red. Churches became slaughterhouses. This wasn't war. It was cleansing justified by theology, fueled by fear. Over the next 2 decades, The campaign continued. Castles were taken, heretics burned. The Inquisition was born because the sword could kill the body, but ideas needed more subtle tools. And here, crusading took its darkest turn yet. Because it wasn't about land. It wasn't even about conversion. It was about control. Once the crusade ended, the region was pacified, not just spiritually, but politically. The independent culture of southern France was stamped out. Its language, Occitan, began to fade. Its nobility, once proud and diverse, was replaced with northern lords loyal to the French crown and the Roman Church. It was a victory, but not one sung in church. Even in Rome, there was unease, because when you teach people that violence is holy and that any enemy can be a heretic, there's no end to who can be next. And just when it seemed crusade couldn't sink lower along, came children. But we'll get to that next. Because the most tragic crusade of all was led not by kings, but by kids. The year is 1212. Europe is restless. Crusading fever still simmers in the blood. The Holy Land remains out of reach. The adult campaigns have stalled, faltered, or collapsed under greed and politics. And into this space steps a child. Actually, thousands of them. This is the story of the so-called Children's Crusade Apart legend, part truth and all tragedy. It begins in France, with a boy named Stephen of Cloyes, just 12 years old. He claimed that Jesus had appeared to him disguised as a poor pilgrim, giving him a divine mission: lead a peaceful crusade of children to convert the Muslims, not through swords, but through innocence. Word spreads fast. In a world that saw visions in clouds and messages in dreams, Stephen's claim struck a chord. Crowds gathered. Children listened. And soon, Stephen wasn't alone. Tens of thousands, yes. Tens of thousands soft young people, mostly teenagers and preteens, began following him. Peasants' sons, shepherds, orphans, even some girls disguised as boys. They walked barefoot, singing hymns, believing the sea would part for them like it had for Moses. It didn't. The sea stayed exactly where it was. Still, they marched. Over mountains, through rain and heat, begging for food. Sleeping in fields. Many fell ill. Others vanished. And still more were never seen again. At the same time, a similar movement started in Germany, led by a boy named Nicholas. His group was better organized, more structured, but no less doomed. Both groups believed they were called by God, and both believed that purity alone would be enough. But purity doesn't pay for ships. And that's where things take a darker turn. When Stephen's group reached Marseille, they found no miracle, no parting sea. Instead, 2 merchants offered ships, 7 of them, to ferry the children to the Holy Land. It seemed like divine providence. It wasn't. The merchants were slavers. 2 of the ships sank in a storm. The other 5 reached North Africa, where the children, those who hadn't already died from disease or exhaustion, were sold into slavery. Sold. To be worked, abused, forgotten. The number taken varies by source, but estimates suggest several thousand children never returned. It wasn't just a failed crusade. It was a mass abduction, sanctified by ignorance. As for Nicholas's group, they fared no better. After trudging across the Alps, many of his followers starved or froze before even reaching Italy. A few tried to get papal support in Rome. Pope Innocent III praised their faith, but told them to go home. Most couldn't. They had no homes left to return to. Some were taken in by sympathetic cities. Others vanished into history. And what makes this story even more heartbreaking is how many wanted to believe it was all true. Chroniclers twisted the tale into a moral lesson that children were more faithful than their elders, that God had tested them, that their suffering would be rewarded. But behind the sermons, behind the stained glass windows, the reality remained. Tens of thousands of children walked toward a desert they would never reach, not by God, but by the desperation of a generation that had run out of answers. And the machine of crusade kept grinding. Because even after this, Europe wasn't finished. The next crusade would be aimed not at Jerusalem, but at Egypt. By the mid-13th century, crusading had become a kind of tradition that each new generation of European rulers felt compelled to uphold. But the dream of retaking Jerusalem had hit a wall. Literally. So now, they tried something else. If you couldn't take the holy city directly, why not cut off the head of the serpent? That head, in their minds, was Egypt. Enter the Fifth Crusade. This time, the target wasn't a desert stronghold or a Levantine citadel. It was the Nile Delta, wealthy and strategic. Control Egypt, the Crusaders believed, and the rest of the Muslim world would fall like dominoes. It sounded logical. It wasn't. In 1217, a fresh army of Crusaders arrived, led by King Andrew II of Hungary and the Duke of Austria. They began by attacking the Muslim-held port city of Damietta in northern Egypt. Damietta was no easy conquest. It was fortified, surrounded by swampy waters, and protected by the Ayyubid dynasty Saladin's successors. But after a prolonged siege and thousands of deaths, the Crusaders finally took the city in 1219. And then they stalled. They argued, waited, celebrated too early. The Sultan offered a deal. Surrender Damietta in exchange for Jerusalem. Yes, Jerusalem. And the Crusaders refused. Why? Because the papal legate, Cardinal Pelagius, believed that military victory was imminent. He claimed God wanted them to win it all, not through compromise, but through conquest. And so, they marched south toward Cairo, right into disaster. In 1221, trapped by rising Nile floods, Muslim forces, and their own incompetence, the Crusaders were surrounded, their food spoiled, their morale collapsed. Many drowned trying to retreat. The survivors were forced to surrender and hand Damietta right back. Thousands died. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. It was one of the most humiliating chapters in Crusader history. But Europe wasn't done humiliating itself. A few years later, a new strategy was attempted: diplomacy. In 1229, Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, managed to do what generations of bloodshed had failed to achieve. She got Jerusalem back. Without a single battle. Through negotiation. The Muslim leader at the time, Al-Kamil, Saladin's nephew, had bigger problems: wars in Syria, internal rebellions. He offered Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth in exchange for peace. Frederick agreed, and the city was handed over peacefully. But here's the twist. Because Frederick had done this without papal approval and had been excommunicated at the time, many in Europe refused to recognize the victory. He walked into Jerusalem, crowned himself, and returned to Europe. No parades, no songs, just silence. Because if the crusade didn't come soaked in blood and sanctioned by the Pope, was it even a crusade at all? Apparently not. Within 15 years, Muslims had retaken Jerusalem again. And so, by the time of the Seventh Crusade, the pendulum had swung back to violence. But this time, a new king would try to lead the charge. Not for glory, not for land, but because he believed it was his divine duty. And his name was Louis IX, the king who would become a saint, but also a prisoner. Louis IX of France was not like the other kings. He didn't just want to fight for God. He wanted to be worthy of God. Known for his piety, charity, and strict adherence to Christian morals, Louis was the kind of man who washed lepers' feet, fasted regularly, and unlike many rulers, actually believed what he preached. So when he launched the Seventh Crusade in 1248, it wasn't just politics. It was a sacred mission. The plan? Attack Egypt again. Take Damietta. March to Cairo. Break the Muslim stronghold from the inside out. Sound familiar? It should. Because it was almost exactly what the Fifth Crusade had attempted and failed. But Louis believed he would succeed where others had faltered, because his cause was pure. And at first, it seemed to be working. Damietta fell easily in 1249. Muslim forces were caught off guard. The Crusaders marched inland, buoyed by the victory and led by a king who dressed modestly and traveled with a personal confessor instead of court jesters. But then reality hit. The Nile flooded, food ran short, disease crept into the camps, and the Egyptian forces regrouped fast. The decisive blow came at the Battle of Al-Mansura. The Crusaders, lured into narrow city streets, were ambushed by Egyptian troops. Chaos erupted. Streets ran with blood. Louis's brother was killed. The Crusader army shattered. Louis himself, this noble, righteous king, was captured. A Christian king, in chains. It was unprecedented. Held hostage for weeks, Louis remained calm, even gracious. He negotiated his own release, along with thousands of other prisoners, paying a massive ransom and handing Damietta back. And then, surprisingly, he stayed in the Holy Land for 4 more years. Not to fight, but to help rebuild. He constructed fortresses, funded hospitals, offered aid to Christian refugees, even met with Muslim leaders, treating them with dignity and care. Louis left the Holy Land in 1254 without reclaiming Jerusalem, but unlike many before him, he returned with honor. In France, he was hailed as a pious hero, later canonized as Saint Louis, the only French king ever to earn that title. And yet, his crusade was a failure. Jerusalem was still lost, the Muslim world still held the upper hand, and now even sainthood couldn't disguise a growing truth. The crusading era was dying, not with a bang, but a slow collapsone king. One city, one broken army at a time. But Louis wasn't done yet, because 20 years later, he'd try again. Older, wiser, and headed for North Africa, a place that would become his tomb. King Louis IX was in his mid-50s, battle-scarred, and still carrying the burden of a lost Jerusalem on his back. He had already been to the Holy Land, already been captured, already ransomed himself back to freedom. But that wasn't enough. He believed his first crusade had failed because he had not suffered enough. So, against the advice of his counselors, against the tide of history, Louis launched one final crusade, Eighth Crusade. But this time, he wouldn't strike at Egypt or Jerusalem. This time, he set his sights on Tunis. Why? Historians still debate. Maybe it was strategic. Tunis controlled access to the Mediterranean. Maybe Louis believed the Sultan there might convert to Christianity. Or maybe he simply thought God was calling him to die on the sands of North Africa. What he found wasn't glory. It was dysentery. Within weeks of landing, the Crusader camp turned into a field hospital. Soldiers collapsed under the scorching sun. Sanitation broke down. Disease spread like wildfire. Louis tried to keep morale up. He led prayers, ordered water, gave alms. And then he fell ill. It was quick, brutal. On the 25th of August, 1270, King Louis IX St. Louis in the dirt under a tattered Crusader banner. No battlefield heroism, no triumphant return. Just a fever, a prayer, and the sound of buzzing flies. His son carried his body back to France, and the crusade died with him. Literally. The Eighth Crusade never reached Jerusalem, never changed the balance of power, never even reached beyond the beach. And yet, Louis was canonized. Because in the minds of many, he was the perfect crusader, holy, selfless, and willing to suffer for a cause. But if Louis was the final saint of the movement, what followed was its final gasp. In 1291, the city of Acre, last major crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, fell to Muslim forces. The battle was vicious. The walls were breached. The Templars made a last stand. But in the end, nothing could stop it. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was gone. After nearly 2 centuries of warfare, the cross had been pushed back to Europe. And yet, something strange happened. Even as the Crusader states collapsed, the idea of crusading didn't die. It adapted, shifted, mutated. Because now the Holy War would move somewhere new into memory. And memory, unlike kingdoms, never truly falls. With the fall of Acre in 1291, the physical crusades ended, but the spiritual ones, they were just beginning. You see, crusading had never just been about land. It was about narrative, about the idea that violence, if wrapped in holiness, could be redemptive. And once that idea took root, it was almost impossible to kill. In the centuries that followed, the crusading impulse evolved into something more abstract, but no less powerful. No more marches to Jerusalem. Now, the battles were fought in memory, politics, and identity. Let's start with the military. Orders the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights. When the Holy Land was lost, these warrior monks didn't disband. They shifted their focus. The Teutonic Knights moved north, turning their attention to Eastern Europe, where they launched a long, bloody campaign against the pagan peoples of the Baltic Lithuanians, Prussians, Estonians. It was called a Northern Crusade. The goal wasn't Jerusalem. It was conversion by conquest. Whole regions were baptized at sword point, their old gods crushed under the weight of steel and scripture. Elsewhere, the Reconquista Spain's long push to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule gathered steam, and while it had started before the First Crusade, it now took on crusading language and energy. Knights from across Europe came to fight in Spain, drawn not just by promises of plunder, but by papal indulgences, spiritual rewards for military service. By 1492, Muslim Granada fell, and the crusade was complete in European soil. But even that wasn't the end, because crusading rhetoric would find new enemies. Not just Muslims, not just heretics, but other Christians. During the Protestant Reformation, both Catholics and Protestants used crusade language to justify persecution. Holy war turned inward. Countries bled not over shrines, but over scripture. And in the age of colonialism, the old crusader mindset was quietly smuggled into a new vessel. Civilization. Missionaries, soldiers, and settlers crossed oceans with Bibles in one hand and weapons in the other, believing they were bringing salvation to the heathen world. It wasn't called a crusade, but the logic was the same. Holy cause, just war, divine mandate. The medieval cross had become a European compass. And what's most disturbing, what lingers, is how deeply that idea still runs. Modern politicians still use the word crusade to describe campaigns against drugs, poverty, terrorism, as if all struggle, all suffering is righteous if we just believe hard enough. And for many, the image of the crusader remains romantic. The brave knight, the shining sword, the righteous war. But peel back the armor, and what do you find? Starvation, slaughter, betrayal. Thousands of ordinary people walking into deserts with no maps, no food, and no idea that they were pawns in a game far older than they realized. And yet, they believed. Because crusade was never just a military movement. It was a dream. A dream that pain could mean purpose, that suffering could be sacred, that somewhere across the sea was a place worth dying for. But dreams can become nightmares. And the Crusades, like so many holy wars, left behind both. So what was it all for? All those Livistons of thousands lost to thirst, to arrows, to fever and betrayal. All those cities burned, bodies desecrated, promises made and broken. Did the crusade succeed? Not really. Jerusalem was briefly held and then lost again. The Crusader states collapsed one by one, their borders constantly shrinking like ice, melting under a sun that never stopped rising. Muslims, Jews, Christians, even Eastern Orthodox believers were all caught in the crosshairs. And Europe? It didn't return triumphant. It returned changed. Because the Crusades weren't just fought abroad, they altered the very structure of medieval society. Let's start with the Church. Pope Urban II had launched the First Crusade to extend papal power, and for a time it worked. The Church became a military engine, offering spiritual rewards for physical conquest. But over time, that power backfired. Because when Crusades failed us, they often did the Pope's credibility. When holy wars turned into bloody disasters, it wasn't just kings who were blamed, it was God's mouthpieces. And that shook faith. Then there were the knights, those armored champions of the cross. For a while, crusading gave them purpose, a place to direct their violent tendencies, a cause nobler than feuding over pastures and pigs. But war breeds war. Many returned home hardened, poorer, sometimes maimed or ill. Crusading didn't always elevate them. Often, it just ground them down. Meanwhile, monarchs gained power. While nobles drained their coffers on faraway campaigns, kings stayed behind, consolidating their lands. And as military orders rose and fell, centralized authority began to look more and more appealing. Crusade, in this way, helped build the modern state. Even trade changed. The routes opened by crusaders dangerous and meandering, though they were sparked interest in the wider world. Spices, silk, glass, and sugar began moving westward. Italian port cities like Venice and Genoa exploded in wealth. Commerce flourished alongside corpses. And culturally, crusaders returned with more than loot. They brought ideasm, adopted, some feared, medical knowledge, philosophical texts, exotic foods, new instruments, and architectural styles. In time, these cross-cultural exchanges helped ignite the Renaissance. Irony of ironies, a war born of fear and faith accidentally fertilized progress. But for every poem or invention that came from this period, there were also pogroms, massacres, cities reduced to rubble. And none of it changed the fact that millions believed they were doing God's will even as they tore each other apart. In the end, the Crusades were not a triumph of good over evil, nor were they a neat story of faith and heroism. They were messy, brutal, filled with contradictions. A holy mission built on blood. And we're not done yet, because next, we step back and look at the stories how they've been retold, repackaged, and remembered. From medieval scrolls to modern films, the Crusades didn't just shape history. They became myth. We remember the Crusades as knights in gleaming armor, swords raised under the blazing sun, banners snapping in the wind as they marched to liberate the Holy Land. But that's not how they were. That's how they were remembered. Because long after the blood dried, the Crusades didn't disappear, they evolved into legend. Medieval chroniclers had already begun spinning the story. In illuminated manuscripts and church sermons, crusaders were painted as God's chosen warriors, brave, selfless, blessed. Reality was more complicated. Disease, failure, betrayal. But narrative? Narrative always wins. Take the Song of Roland, a heroic tale of Christian knights fighting infidels. Written before the First Crusade, it exploded in popularity afterward because it gave people something to believe in, a script, a moral arc. And as time passed, more myths piled on. The Crusades became the backdrop for stories of noble sacrifice and chivalry. Forgotten were the looted Christian cities, the starving children sold into slavery, the failed kings and crooked clergy. In their place, honor, valor, faith. By the Renaissance, the Crusades had become romantic. Poets and playwrights reimagined the battles as epic quests. Painters filled canvases with sword-wielding saints. The gritty horror was cleaned up like a battlefield turned into a museum display. And in the modern era, the myth got louder. 19th century Europe, deep in its age of empire, revived Crusader imagery to justify colonization. British and French generals compared themselves to medieval knights as they marched into the Middle East. It wasn't coincidence, it was branding. Because Crusader logic is flexible, you can aim it anywhere. In the 20th century, the term was used again by politicians, propagandists, and warmongers. Crusade became shorthand for any righteous campaign, stripped of context and polished for speeches. Even Hollywood got in on it. Think of the movies. Brave knights, evil sultans, desert sunsets and tragic love. The history's a mess, but the aesthetic sells. And today? Well, the legacy is still radioactive. Extremists on both sides, Christian and Muslim, invoke the Crusades to justify violence. Online forums are full of memes about Templars and infidels. Some modern terrorists cite them as ancient grievances. But those weren't the real Crusades. The real ones were colder, dirtier, more desperate. They weren't about honor. They were about land, control, salvation, and very often survival. Still, the myth persists. Because we want heroes. We want stories where we're the good guys, where history has a plot and war has a reason. The truth is messier, but if we're brave enough to look past the stained glass and steel, we might see something more human underneath. Not holy war, just ordinary people caught in extraordinary madness. And that myth, that desire to rewrite pain into poetry, is maybe the most dangerous legacy of all. So now, we reach the end. The sand has settled, the banners have fallen. The last of the pilgrims and warlords and forgotten soldiers have vanished into the dust. And we're left with a question. What did the Crusades really mean? Not just as a military campaign, but as a human story. Because at the heart of all this, beneath the rhetoric and armor and glory, was something deeply, painfully ordinary. Fear, hope, desperation, faith. Tens of thousands of people left their homes, peasants, nobles, monks, children, not because they craved conquest, but because they believed there was something better across the horizon. A city, a cause, a promise of redemption. And for that promise, they marched. Into deserts they didn't understand. Into battles they couldn't win. Into histories they didn't know they were writing. Many died without ever seeing Jerusalem. Many never understood the politics that used them. They just believed. And that belief was strong enough to carry them across mountains, seas, and years. And yet, belief on its own is not enough. It needs wisdom, justice, mercy. The Crusades often had none of these. They began with a sermon, burned through cities like fire, and ended in ruins, both literal and moral. In their wake, they left deep scars. In the Middle East, in Europe, in theology, and in memory. But even scars tell stories. They warn, they whisper, they remind us that even the most righteous cause can warp into something monstrous if left unchecked. They remind us that religion and power, when fused together, can forge both cathedrals and catastrophes. And maybe that's the lesson we carry forward. Not the myth of noble knights, but the reality of broken people trying to make sense of their world. People who walked into the desert not to conquer, but to believe. People who wanted meaning so badly, they were willing to die for it. And in that sense, maybe the Crusades were never really about Jerusalem at all. Maybe they were about us, about the stories we tell ourselves, about who we think we are when we stand under a flag or behind a cross, about what we're willing to do in the name of something sacred, and what we become when we forget that the people on the other side are just as human, just as afraid, just as faithful, just as lost. So now, with the torches burned low and the armor rusting in the corners of history, we leave behind the long, aching road of the Crusades. It's easy to look back and see only chaos, sieges, betrayals, bones in the sand. But it's also a mirror. Because the people of that time weren't so different from us. They wanted answers. They wanted to believe there was a higher meaning to their pain, that their lives were part of a grand, divine pattern. They wanted something eternal. And maybe so do we. Maybe that's why we tell these stories, why we come back to the same dusty crossroads of faith and fire, not to celebrate them, but to understand them, to remind ourselves of the power belief holds, the beauty it can inspire, the danger it can awaken. Tonight, we walked beside those pilgrims and kings. We saw the cities rise. We watched them fall. We heard the prayers and the war cries and the silence that came after. And now it's time to rest. So breathe deeply. You're not in the desert. You're not starving on the march to Antioch. You're safe, warm, still. Let the past sink behind you like a sun setting over broken battlements. And if your dreams take you eastward through forests, across oceans, into ancient holy cities, may you walk not as a soldier, but as a seeker, not to conquer, but to remember.